Zach, we are back and we are getting into our first moves to make of the Dynasty offseason. We'll be back every other week talking moves to make in your Dynasty leagues, but feel free to drop questions in the comments of other videos. Try to get to those as much as we can. Where we always get to the questions is in our community Discord group chat. If you haven't checked it out yet, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. We have a free 1-week trial. Get in the Discord, see how you like it. Tag along, check out the bonus podcast as well in the Rewinder tier. With that said, first move you got to make. Like the video, leave a comment. What moves are you looking to make as we get into this offseason and get into it? Finally, all the regular season games are wrapped up, but we have some playoffs ahead of us. But with all of that said, Zach, we're going to get into our first segment here, talking our Dynasty focus of the week. Give the people what they came for, the content they came for. Right off the rip, where does our focus lie heading into this coming week, the next couple weeks of the Dynasty offseason? What are we looking to do? Zach, I want to hear from you. What is your Dynasty focus right now?
My focus right now, as we have just turned the leaf into a new league year, hopefully your league has turned the page into a new league year. I'm scouring the league, and I'm looking for owners who need what I have, Bob. You're not likely to find a trade partner who doesn't need what you do have, right? If let's say, Bob, you have an excess of running backs, and I have a good amount of running backs, you probably don't need to trade for a running back, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you could insert anything there, draft picks, quarterbacks, tight ends, whatever. So I'm trying to find somebody who does need what I do have a good amount of that I can use to distribute the wealth to other areas. Do you have an abundance of draft picks? Well, who has none in your league, Bob? Do you have an excess of talent, startable talent? Well, who needs some in your league? If it's a start 10 or start 11, pretty sure there's some rosters in your league that really need some starting talent to fill their lineups. And, look, I know it's January, whatever it is, but I'm still trying to fill out a lineup, and just project what my team would look like. So, I'm really starting those dialogues and saying, hey, I have some extra wide receivers. Are you interested? That is the general concept of what I'm sending out at this moment. And it's a yes or it's a no. And we move forward from there. And you thumbs up, no, I'm good. I'll look for one in the draft, or we start a dialogue and maybe we work out a potential trade. I've sent you 3 trades I've made in the last 3 days, Bob. Now, again, I'm in 30-something leagues. So it really does help when you have that kind of volume to work with. But it's just, and I'll talk about this later, where I am just having hypothetical dialogues of trades that can happen now or trades that can happen around the rookie draft. Like I said, I'll discuss that later. But I'm just looking around my league right now and saying, who has what I need and who needs what I have? And can we figure out a deal that works for the both of us? And that's really my starting point for trades during the offseason.
Going back to a previous video from a while back, did a video on the channel, how to create trades that actually get accepted. One of the best methods of creating trades that actually get accepted is working off of exactly what you just touched on, working off of your own areas of strength to teams that need help in those areas that you're strong in. Because what you do with those areas of strength, you go to another team, say you're flush with running backs, that team isn't. Say they're flush with wide receivers, your team isn't. There's a nice symbiotic relationship there where, like you said, you can kind of spread the wealth, make both teams better. When you're trading, that's what you want to do. You got to work with your trade partner to get a deal done. They're no longer your opponent when you're trying to get a deal done. They're your trade partner. Takes 2 to tango, takes 2 to get a deal done and help out both sides. So I love this point and just extending those, conversations and, taking that, and I'll touch on this a little bit too later is, taking that self-reflection, take inventory of where your team is at, what you have a good bit of. How can you help the rest of the league? Help yourself, essentially. So with that said, focus for me, if you haven't done this already or you didn't have this notion coming into the offseason of what your team was going to be, here's your wake-up call. It's time to do this. Decide what direction this roster is headed in if you or I haven't already. Are you a rebuilding team? Do you need to rebuild? Are you coming off a strong contendership where things didn't pan out or they did, and now you need to go get younger, you need to retool, whatever the case is, or what do you need to add to remain a contender? Or is it time to rebuild? Are you still rebuilding, or hey, were you stuck in the middle last year? How the heck do you get out of the middle? Do you trade away all your assets? Do you try to improve your assets to get out of the middle? The case of the co-mid as opposed to COVID, a case of, trying to get the mid-tier players off of your roster. That's one of the biggest sicknesses you can deal with once you're stuck in the middle, in my opinion, is just having a lot of mid-tier players and not having a lot of pop on your roster. So big thing for me, why this is my first thing to do if I haven't done it already. And this is, kind of boilerplate basics, but easy to forget if you're new to Dynasty. If this is your first Dynasty offseason, or even maybe your second, maybe whatever the case is, maybe this is just something you haven't, been involved in yet, whatever the case is, it's so important to do this first if you haven't already, because this ideation, whatever you come up with, whether you're a rebuilding team, a contending team, you're, pivoting off of one to the other, retooling, or trying to get out of the middle, this ideation should dictate the type of moves you're trying to make this offseason, as well as the players that can be involved in those moves, whether you're buying or selling in ways that make sense. Obviously, if you're a rebuilding team, that rules out a lot of old players. You don't want to be buying old players. If you can pick some off the waiver wire that you can hope to flip during the regular season, sure, fair game, love that concept, but shouldn't be buying them. And if you're a contending team, maybe be that much more interested in moving your rookie draft picks for proven commodities, as opposed to players that might need to develop before you can reliably stick them into a starting roster. So if you haven't done it already, like I said, this is your wake-up call. Decide where your roster is headed this season. If you need help with that, we offer roster reviews. Check that out in the YouTube description box, how to get one done for your team. We can help kind of take a look, offer some direction on where the team should go, where we believe it's headed, so on and so forth. But Zach, feel free to touch on this point if you have anything to add.
Yeah, this is a good one, because if you make this decision now, you are just that much more in a better position heading into whatever it is. If you, commit to, hey, I'm trying to compete next year, as opposed to somebody who's like, oh, let me see how the draft shakes out. You're just that, and that also works out. And it's better to see, it's better to understand that concept from a rebuilding aspect, where you say, I am rebuilding, and you've made that decision before anyone else. Because like I always say, Bob, if you commit to rebuilding now, Bob, you have 11 other owners that may potentially be trade partners. Whereas if you decide in, April, May, and that's not necessarily a poor time to understand and decide that you want to rebuild, but if somebody else has already decided before you, then you're working with less trade partners potentially. There's a scenario where, the first 2 weeks of the season comes, you still haven't understood or decided which direction you want to go, and 2 or 3 other managers have already decided to rebuild. And so now you're working with you're trying to cast a much smaller net, because you're now trying to trade pieces to 8, 9, or 10 teams, as opposed to it being 9, 10, or 11, whatever the situation may be, depending on your league. So this is a great point. Sometimes it's tough. We are talking to somewhat of a newer audience in some of these videos, where it's like, hey, we don't understand. This is a long-term dynasty picture, not a redraft picture. And that's really what you've come here to try and understand is, and you get it so much more after a year. You really do. But in that first year, it's tough. It's really tough to understand, hey, this is a long-term picture. But for me, it's what I love these 2-year, 3-year rebuilds potentially. I've joined some new leagues in the last few weeks. Yes, I got rid of some. Calm down. That are absolutely long-term rebuilds, and I'm already starting to collect 25 and 2026 picks. So somebody else in that league, Bob, who waits to decide for that year to rebuild, I'm already ahead of them for that year. So that's why it's so important to understand your direction and also your timeline in that direction, Bob.
Yeah, I love that a lot. I think you touched on the economy of available symbiotic draft partners, or trade partners, excuse me, where it makes sense to, as a rebuilder, buy from competitive teams that are trying to, get more competitive assets on their team while you're trying to rebuild, and vice versa. There's just a nice symbiotic relationship there, where it's tough to trade with other rebuilding teams, because you have to find things that work well for both teams, and that's where you get into kind of sticky situations on making deals happen. But it is possible to do, not something to rule out, but just having that symbiotic relationship goes back to how to create trades that actually get accepted. Just one way to create trades that actually get accepted is a major point, is having that symbiotic relationship that makes sense for both sides very easily. Let's get into our first move to make here. And we're actually talking about like official moves to make. There's a lot of strategy on my end today, a lot of, focuses from a dynasty aspect. You actually have a beautiful move to make here, a consideration that we'll be talking about on the channel for weeks to come, months to come, who knows. But either which way, I like this point. It's time. The pinnacle of we don't hate players, we hate values. Take it away, Zach.
We have come full circle with the Atlanta Falcons. Ding dong, the freaking witch is dead. Arthur Smith is fired. He is gone. He had 3 consecutive 7-10 seasons. And how about this, Bob? Every single year that Arthur Smith was the Falcons head coach, they ended up with the 8th pick in the draft. 3 years in a row. You cannot make it up, including this upcoming season. They have the 8th pick in the draft. It's unbelievable. Like the level of consistency by Arthur Smith as to the team's finish,
like
and
Jeff
the team's
Fisher level.
It's unbelievable.
Consistency.
But not even record. Same draft pick every single year. 2
Jeff
years
Fisher
ago,
wishes he could be Arthur Smith.
Right. In terms of his consistency. I'm looking to buy these players now. This is probably, and we are in a window. We don't know. It might be a little bit because, the names that we're hearing associated with the Falcons head coaching job are names that are still in the playoffs right now. So they're, they may interview, they may not, and that may be a couple of weeks. So we don't know. So I think you have a window here to buy Falcons players at what I would consider a reasonably fair or even above average price in your favor. I traded for Bijan in a league just before we started this video. To give a little context, this was a startup 1 year ago. You know how I do startups. I don't win year one startups. I traded for other teams first. I ended up with the 102 and the 103. The 102 was mine. The 103 was someone else's. I traded that 103 back to the owner of 103 and 402 for Bijan Robinson and a couple dollars fab. Mike would be proud. But I told you, I'm working on fab acquisitions every single trade. Every single trade I've sent you, Bob, has had fab in it. I don't know if you've noticed. Making myself proud here. Sticking to my Dynasty New Year's resolution.
There you go.
Where would Bijan Robinson land in the draft? Not knowing what we know about what happened with him and Arthur Smith, but the Bijan Robinson, the draft prospect of 2023, where does Bijan Robinson land in the 2024 draft? Because I don't think it's any later than 103.
Man, I have a tough time with that just because of the quarterbacks that are going to be up there. I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's a bad deal by any stretch. I think the value shake out because how I'm looking at it is where the players that are picked in the rookie draft, where they end up in the startup compared to where Bijan is in startups.
Sure.
That's where I'm thinking, because I think the value
100%.
of the pick you exchange for Bijan, pretty bang on with whatever player gets drafted there is probably going to be right next to Bijan in startup values in Superflex at the end of the day. So I think this value is great. I think it's spot on, and I think depending on which way you're going, if you're set at quarterback, hey, I think you did it. I think you did great, especially if you're looking to kind of turn
I
the
also
corner
have
soon.
102. So
right. Exactly.
If I'm not set at quarterback, I can address it there.
For sure. That's a good point. Yeah. So no, I like the deal. And I think, like I said, at the end of the day, because Bijan is tough. Because I think he goes in that tier along with Malik Neighbors, Bowers, maybe not as much, maybe not Bowers. Maybe that makes a tier break because of, unless it's tight end premium. But I think he goes in that tier with Neighbors and the 2 other quarterbacks that are not Caleb Williams or Marvin Harrison Jr. So I think he slots into that. I think he slots in the 3 to 6 range. So I could see him as early as 1-3. I could see him as late as 1-6, especially with this running back class being questionable. He would be very inflated in this class, in my opinion. So I don't hate the trade one bit. I like the concept. I'm with you on the concept. Brought it up in one of our roster reviews a couple weeks back, saying that, hey, I'm moving London in this deal right now, but I will say I'm not making any moves with London until, since there was smoke starting with Arthur Smith getting fired, full pun intended, smoke, there's fire. But came to fruition. I think there's almost going to be arguments out there for selling Drake London again now because of people that want to buy back in. Now, where's the value shift there that you can make the move? I just wanted to share real quick a couple examples from our Patreon Discord. Completed trades for Drake London and Kyle Pitts, both being acquired for the 111 in Superflex drafts. Now, this was before the Arthur Smith firing, but looking ahead, having that foresight, and I think, is there any coach out there that could be worse for these guys at this point? You have to figure with this new regime that a big talking point is, hey, we've invested 3 top 8 picks into these offensive players, and we are not getting as much out of them as we believe we should. And maybe a 4th, depending on where they go with 8th pick, if they trade up to get a quarterback or if a quarterback falls in them, whatever the case is. I think that's going to be a hot topic discussion, but I just wanted to throw those out there. I think you probably realistically have to pay a little bit more than the 111 for those guys now, probably add maybe a 25 second to get those deals a little right. And I don't hate that for buying either of those guys. But back to you, Zach, with this point.
My main point here, besides saying, hey, buy Falcons players, is that I'm targeting in the specific order 1, 2, 3, Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Kyle Pitts in that order. When I came up with this point, I really wasn't sure what I would trade for Kyle Pitts. I think somebody else in one of my other leagues was asking, and I kind of entertained that conversation in the league chat. It's still a tough one for me, right? With the tight ends that we saw come up last year and really raise the position overall, it's really hard for me to kind of pinpoint a value that I feel comfortable trading for Kyle Pitts, just because I know it's going to take a first-round pick plus more.
Sure.
I don't think it's going to take 2 first-round picks anymore, but it's still going to take more than I probably want to offer. But Drake London, I would probably feel comfortable if I had some kind of a late first, even a mid first. I don't know about this year. Depends on what prospect I could be landing there. I'd feel comfortable acquiring for Drake London. But the problem that we've always identified in this channel with Drake London owners is people who have Drake London love Drake London so much. So
I think 90% of the time you're correct with that, but just because you can't say if everybody is that has London still loves him, because I think there's people out there that just want to get rid of the headache. They don't believe he's got what it takes. They, maybe liked him when they drafted him, maybe weren't as gung-ho. I still think that's probably 90% true, but I don't think floating out offers. I think there are going to be the absolutely, there's going to be the people out there that, the guys who have ripped us in the comments for saying we don't like Drake London's value. Sorry. And Drake London comes to, show that value is too high. But at that point, they're probably going to want more than I'm willing to pay, maybe, and rightfully so. Hey, if you got him, I'm saying hold him. I'm not saying sell him. I'm saying there's probably discussions to be had for possibly selling him, especially depending on what crazy offensive mind they get down there, whatever the case is. I'm not going to say it, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a point where we hit another apex where it might be fun to sell Drake London again. But I'm not saying it now. I like the mindset now. I think there's some accessibility here, and that's what we always look for with trade targets is accessibility. Cheaper that he's been for a while, another quote unquote down season, showed some flashes. We've touched on that as well, but obviously not the top 10, 15 season that people wanted to be expected with a poor quarterback and poor offense in general. It's looking brighter in Atlanta for what that offense might look like. I think, like I said, I don't think it could be worse. So I'm in on this concept. I'm in on the acquisition of these 3. Kyle Pitts, I do get your hesitation with of not being as interested in. He'd probably be my 3rd on the totem pole as well. Just because there's going to come a time where he might cost more than another tight end who I think is going to put up similar numbers, at the end of the day. So, and that's where, I don't know, I'll go value shop. I'll go buy somebody else. If I have to pay the same thing to buy him, or not that I'm saying it's at this point yet, but if I have to pay the same thing to buy him as I have to buy Laporta, I'm going to go buy Laporta. If it gets to that point, I'm not saying it is now, but that's kind of a gauge I'm at when I'm thinking about that. With that in the books and all of our Falcons and Drake London love in the books, especially Bijan, though. We like that Bijan buy, Zach. And I love that you went out of your way to go buy him for the sake of the video. And I love that you do that for a lot of our trades. My next thought here, another focus, another move to make, quote unquote, allocation of assets. What is every asset to my team? That is what I'm asking myself right now. Do this on paper if you have to. but figure out what every player and draft pick is to this team over the course of the offseason. Ask yourself things like, who am I keeping and intending to start long-term, or at least having my roster long-term? If I'm a competitive team, which players are good secondary assets for lineup help? Not the guys I'm necessarily wanting to build around, but, the Tyler Lockett's of the world, the, Adam Thielen in his prime, kind of not Adam Thielen in his prime, but over the last couple of years where you kind of chuck them into your lineup to help supplement your lineup here and there. Players like that. What players primarily identify as stashes with some upside, and who are some roster cloggers I can probably look to get rid of one way or another, whether that's via trade, just an outright savage cut, who knows. But why I'm doing this is something that can provide somewhat of a roadmap for how to go about your offseason, how to proceed through the offseason by hyper focusing on areas you need to address. How can I add more players that I want to steadily build around and want to chuck in my starting lineup with the other players I have, the draft picks I have that I'm willing to move as well. That's something to think about. What draft picks are you willing to move? What ones are you more likely holding on to that you foresee turning into, whether you draft with them or trade out with them into somebody else? What ones of those possibly identify as players that you're chucking into your lineup for the long term? But along with identifying the areas you might need to address, they can also address areas where you have access, where you can kind of pull from whether it's, a wide receiver room, running back room, tight end room, quarterback room, whatever the case is, where you can pull from those to allocate those assets elsewhere to help strengthen a poor wide receiver room, poor tight end room, whatever the case is. This is number 2 on the checklist when I'm starting to get into the offseason. Allocation of assets. What is everyone on my team? Who's liquid? Who's able to be moved? Who am I less likely to move? What is the case? Zach, I want to hear your thoughts on this before you dive in your next point.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of exactly what we do with our roster reviews, right? We identify core players, trade pieces, players that just I just don't think I can get anything for, and that are cuts. The path of this team, which you spoke about earlier. So, and it goes into what I said earlier. It's like, hey, identify what you have that you don't really necessarily need, and see if you can allocate that to some other position. So this is where it really gets into, and this doesn't take too long. You look at your team; it takes a couple minutes, and we're here to help you. We have the Discord, we have the roster review, so on and so forth. Just say, hey, this is start 10. I need to start 3 wide receivers. There's 2 flex spots. I can start 5 wide receivers. Do I have 5 wide receivers that I feel comfortable starting? Do I have 6 or 7 with bye weeks, with injuries, so on and so forth? Then you plan to buy one via waivers, you plan to draft one, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, this is where you really start to get into the nitty gritty of your roster construction. And, how do you make yourself better, or how do you allocate these assets towards, if I'm rebuilding, right? Doesn't necessarily have to be like, hey, is this player going to start in my lineup? No, but is this player going to start for me in 2 to 3 years? Does this player fit my timeline? So on and so forth. So very important part in not only, if you're a team that's trying to win a championship now, but if you're rebuilding, does this player fit my timeline for whenever I'm trying to compete?
Absolutely love those additional points there, Zach. And I love this point that you have up ahead of us here. And if you want to do some of this with us, best place to go, patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. Get in the Discord. I drop a little link for this every time we do one. But before spoiling anything, Zach, tell me what you got with this next one.
It's time to start mock drafting, Bob. You really need to understand generally where players' values will fall. Now, look, it's gonna change. The process and the way that this really works, right, is like the later in the mock draft, the more fluid their position is. It's very unlikely Caleb Williams is going 110, right?
Right.
But Bo Nix could go 110, could go 205. We don't know. But you want to have an idea of generally where values stand. Now, look, I'm not doing this to project where second and third round picks will land in April. This practice lends itself to me understanding if I need to move up to draft a player that I'm targeting, or a player that I will need to fill out a certain position. I'll give you an example. I have a league where I have the 112. No, it wasn't mine. I didn't win the championship in that league. I have the 112. It's my first round pick. I I talked about the trade I made the other day for 104. And I'm starting to see that there are interest in my quarterbacks in the league via the trade market. And so I'd like to go and acquire another quarterback in the draft. Well, I don't really feel comfortable at right now in January waiting to see if I get the 5th best quarterback at 112. And there's an owner in the league that has 106, 107, and 108. And so what I did is I started that conversation of, hey, man, just, touching base, which, by the way, touching base is due diligence. Like,
Sure.
you got to start having these conversations. Touching base, is there a hypothetical trade that you could potentially see? And really what that does is just plant the seed that, hey, this guy is interested in moving up. I highly doubt, at least I wouldn't be drafting 106 through 108, all 3 picks.
Sure.
I'm drafting 1 or 2 of those, and I am trading back or trading out of one of those picks. So I'm just planting the seed of, hey, this guy's interested. I'm not that far back. I'm at 112. It's a difference of 4 or 5 picks from 108 to see if I can get that quarterback. So, starting to mock draft really helps me understand where certain players' values are landing. That's going to be an ever-changing process, specifically the guys in the 2nd and 3rd rounds. Starting just to have those conversations. I'm not making a trade based off that. I want to make sure we understand that, because these are most likely draft day trades. These are not trades that are going to get done anytime soon, because what if I could pick up Michael Penix at 112 or whatever it is? A quarterback that I feel good enough about. Hopefully Michael Penix is a first-round quarterback. A lot TBD. We're recording this before the national championship game, so we don't know how he looked that day. But this is just really the process of beginning the dialogue to let an owner know that I'm interested in potentially moving up. You could also do this to move back. This is, the reason I focused on moving up is because that's what I did. But you could also do this to move back. Say, hey, I don't really need, I have 106 through 108. I don't really need, whatever players are landing here. I have 2 great tight ends. I don't need Brock Bowers. Maybe who would be interested? And then I start to look throughout the league, Bob, who needs a tight end and who's close to me in the draft order. Who can I trade back so they can trade up to get Brock Bowers and I can get 2 or 3 assets for? So I'm starting to mock draft so I can understand where players are falling and I can make moves accordingly based off that.
Yeah, I love this. And this is part of why mock drafting is so important, getting a good feel for, how the board can break in different situations. Always a huge thing to just have in your toolkit, and this is why tier drafting is so important, having tiers set up, knowing draft windows where players can kind of go, their range where they can go as high as they can go, as low as they can go. And anytime you have a conversation with a league mate, whether they're coming to you, whether they're the Zack in your DMs and they're, hey, are you interested in trading down with this pick, or vice versa, whatever the case is, you pin that comment in your brain and you use that as ammo later, because anything anybody says, and, obviously beware of smoke screens and things like that. But anytime, especially in DMs, I don't think many people do the smoke screen in DMs. Maybe they do. I'm a big smoke screener in league chats. I'm a big fan of that. But either which way, anytime something is said, anytime something is hinted at, whatever the case is, keep that in mind, because it's just one thing that, if, like Zack said, if you plant that seed now, if that manager is smart and on top of their stuff, they're going to remember, I don't love what's on the board here at 106 to 108. I don't love what's here. I like 2 of the guys, but I don't need 3 of them. Let's see what Zack wants to trade up for. Let's see what he wants to give me to move up here. There's already that, he already knows there's one pathway to you that he had a conversation with about possibly moving off this pick. And that's something you should keep in mind either which way. When these things happen, it just helps make deals that much smoother and helps lubricate things down the road. And then talking more draft capital stuff and nonsense of the sort, I'm taking draft capital inventory of myself and others. I'm taking inventory of the teams that do or do not have draft capital, and where does the draft capital they have exist? Do they have 1 second-round pick and nothing else? Do they have 1 first-round pick and nothing else? How can I use this to my advantage too, especially if I have that cornucopia of draft picks that we talked about in yesterday's offseason mistakes to avoid video, Zack? If I have a bunch of draft picks, how can I help a team that doesn't have as many draft picks get more draft picks? And on the flip side, if I don't have a lot of draft picks, if I'm sitting there and I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum, how can I find a way to possibly get more draft capital and improve the draft capital I have? How can I use all of this information to maneuver around the draft board, whether I'm trading up, trading down, or possibly looking at buy-in opportunities, getting in on the draft if teams have a ton of draft picks, if they have excessive draft picks, or possible trade out opportunities for myself if other managers have very few draft picks but I could get proven commodities off of their rosters, and then I give them some draft capital in exchange for my efforts. The first thing you have to do here is understand what side of the spectrum you're on, though. And it's pretty easy to do, just because it'll impact the road you have to take to setting up yourself for the draft. That's a lot of what we're going to be talking about over the course of the offseason this year, how to get to the best draft setup you can possibly get with what you have already. So first and foremost, first indicator, if you have fewer picks in the standard, 1 pick per round that you're given by the gods of whatever platform you're drafting on, you'll have the most luck dealing with teams that have more than the standard amount of draft picks, and you'll have the most luck trading players, in parentheses, something they don't already have for picks, or trading higher picks that you have in an attempt to trade down for more draft capital to get more draft capital onto your team. And on the flip side of that, if you have more than the standard, as we've mentioned before, in ways that, hey, we want to build a draft capital. That's one of our favorite ways to build dynasty teams. You're in the driver's seat right now because you have what everybody is going to want over the course of the offseason. Players right now, there's going to be players that get hot and get cold. That's how it's going to run. But the one thing you can guarantee to stay hot, draft capital over the course of the offseason. You have a lot of leverage over the teams that have little draft capital right now, the teams that we discussed before, but you can still make moves being that other team that doesn't have a ton of draft capital. You're not excommunicated from making moves in your league just because you have a little bit of draft capital. But with this in mind, if you have that abundance of draft capital, you can buy players or better draft capital at decent prices because, hey, you don't have a lot of this going on. I have some draft capital for you that I can send your way. You'll be much happier in the draft. You'll be able to get all the rookies you want, or at least a couple more of them. But target the teams with the little draft capital in an attempt to buy proven commodities or better the draft capital you have. This is something I'm looking at in one of my leagues specifically. I took a really hard look. It's one of my most hardcore rebuilding rosters I've probably ever built. And I just have a slew of draft capital. And I'm just looking at ways there's so many teams out there that have maybe 3 or 4 picks in a 5-round draft. I am looking at ways that I can be like, hey, man, you have the 204. What would you want? Would you want to do my 209 and my 305? You get 2 picks now. Something along those lines to try to better the picks I have by that much, to try to tier jump as much as I can up the draft board now. But doing these now, and maybe not necessarily making the moves, but at least at minimum establishing the pathways and consider making some moves on these pick flips now, because something you've mentioned a ton, Zach, is once these picks are moved, they're very hard to buy them from the new owners immediately after they were bought. Like, your best bet, if somebody buys draft capital right now, is waiting a month and a half till they get bored with it to draft it again.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So there's some cat and mouse game at play here, but take inventory of the draft capital you have, your league mates have, and how that affects the moves you're going to be able to make going throughout the course of the offseason. Zach, feel free to chime in here as well.
I really like this one, Bob. And I do have kind of different approaches depending on this. Like, I sent you a trade. We don't have to go over it today, where I already had like 15 draft picks in the league. And my decision anytime I have over 10 draft picks is like, I'm not using these picks. And sure. I'm not like, when I start these trade dialogues, I make sure to tell the owner, hey, listen, I have the same value of 104 today that it will have in April. I understand what we preach on this channel. Mm-hmm. It will gain value. But the way I try to approach it, like, hey, I have this 104, trade. If you want it, pretend you're trading for it in April or May, because I have no problem holding on to this pick. That's how I approach that situation. If I don't have a lot of draft picks, then my immediate thought is, am I 1 or 2 players away? And if not, what I got to try to do is just move back, get 2 picks, get 3 picks, so I can take 3 dart throws as opposed to 1 dart throw.
Sure.
If I've got the 110,
like that,
can I inchworm my way back? Can I go to 112 and pick up a late third? Can I pick up 112 and 312 for my 110, so on and so forth. So can I just add a little bit more, or even if I'm not helping myself now, can I help myself next year and pick up that third round pick?
I was
Yeah,
just going to bring that up. If you are struggling with draft capital this year of what you can really do in your draft, you only have, if you're at the point where you have your standard draft capital or less, sometimes the best thing you could possibly do is try to set yourself up that much more for next year. Trade down a handful of picks, get a second next year. Trade down a handful more of picks, get a third next year. Stay in the draft that you're in, take your shots where you can, but add some more draft capital so you have a little more to play with next season. Whether you're competitive or rebuilding, having draft capital next year is not a bad thing. And it never will be, if you ask me, until you're at the point of the draft and you have too much draft capital kicking around. But the beauty of draft capital, everybody always wants it, no matter what they say, even if they're people that are of the mindset like, oh, F draft capital because I just want the proven players. Draft capital becomes proven players at some point or another. Not always indefinite. It's not a straight line, but at the end of the day, they do become players, and people are going to want them. That one person in the league might not want them, but somebody will. Adding draft capital, that's another way to go about it. Beautiful thing about draft capital is you have so much flexibility with how you choose to use it, and I do like the idea a lot. If you're struggling with adding capital this year, I think it's okay to kind of eat the year to a degree and just say, like, you know what? With my league, with what's going on, I can't get great value to trade back in. I can't get good value to necessarily trade up, whatever the case is. Try trading back, build on for next year, do what you can in that route, especially if you're not getting good value where you end up drafting. Somebody's going to like somebody where you're at the end of the day, because there's always somebody for someone at each draft pick, whether you're in love with that player or not. And we always say, if you're, the last thing I ever want to do is reach down the board to finally grab somebody I like. I'd much rather slide back a handful of picks. Maybe you take the risk of not getting the guy, and this is another discussion for a whole nother day. I am so against the anti get your guy mindset, especially when the value doesn't make sense. Go get your guy at values that make sense. I'm all about it. Don't draft them 6-7 picks early because you don't like what the rest of the board has to offer. But speaking of liking things that we have to offer, I bet you will like our patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind Discord server. Head on over there for a free 7-day trial. And as mentioned, the first move you should be making before you leave this video, liking it, leaving a comment, letting us know what moves you're trying to make to kickstart your off season. Whatever they may be, we want to know. We'll help you out in the comments as much as we can. Definitely help out at the Discord server. If you want help making moves in your league and you want that little extra push, check out the roster reviews that are available in the pinned comment below or in the YouTube description box. We will help you out there. Zach and myself or Mike can take a look at your rosters. Maybe even Nate. Maybe we can convince him to get in on those as well. But with all that said, that's going to be it for this Moves to Make. We will see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.